Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on a journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jan Vermut, and joining me, as always, my co-hosts Jonathan Edwards and Scott Brusson. This episode is brought to you by my company, Ventbridge. We create pain point-driven growth strategies, products, and sales stories. With us today is Steve Portigal. I have been recommending his book, Interviewing Users, How to Uncover Compelling Insights, all the time for anyone interested in interviewing users. It's now out in a second edition that I really recommend, and you can find a promo code to get 10% off in the episode description, as well as at the end of the podcast, which I'm going to mention at the end. So thank you very much for that, Steve. A little bit about him. So Steve helps organizations build more mature user research practices. He has vast experience in interviewing all kinds of users, from families eating breakfasts to rock musicians. So that would be interesting to get into. In these interviews, he has uncovered insights that inform the development of a wide range of services and products, such as medical information systems, wine packaging, and music streaming services. So head over to Portigal.com if you want to know more. Find his books there. And also, I want to mention the Dollars to Donuts podcast that he's hosting, which I really, really recommend. So there's a lot to get into. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
All right. Thanks for having me. It's great to chat with you all.
So I want to start this with kind of a very recent experience. So a couple hours ago, I was literally standing in a field. We're on a project about berry farmers. And I kind of encountered an issue that at least when I started out, was very hard to deal with. Like, how do you react to this? So imagine the scenario. I'm driving up to this farmer's house, or where his farm is. I get out of the car, and on the wall, I see, let's call them politically explicit banners. They clearly didn't align with my perspective, but that was kind of the start of not even the interview, but I knew what I was going into. So I don't want to discuss the kind of the contents of those banners. That's irrelevant, but it's like, how do you go about the situation when you know the person you're interviewing, they will have very strong views and they will be explicit about it? So how can you how to go about such a situation?
There's a lot of that's a great question. And I think if you've done research, you've had some experience like that. And maybe just to, I don't know, brainstorm a little on some of the contexts or context here. I mean, doing research is about encountering opinions different than your own. Although I think when we say that, we think, oh, what people's preferred button location or how they want to onboard or what payment model. Those are things where, right, we all have opinions or expectations about them. And we might talk in this conversation about, what you do about expectations for the product, and so that you can, listen more closely. But we all come into these interviews with, and this is where the word bias gets used, right? And as bias being this terrible word that means we're a bad person. But bias is, and this is not a scholastic definition. This is just my take. Like it's what we expect based on our own experiences. And so, I mean, you counter your biases all the time. I was doing an interview recently, and the person had sent in a little warm-up video to tell us who they were.
Yeah.
And based on how they presented themselves, kind of what their affect was and their energy, and they were talking about something fairly difficult, I felt like, okay, I can talk to this person because I know who they are, how they present themselves. And I started to kind of imagine what our dynamic was going to be.
Yeah.
It was not like that. I have interviewed people where just based on their physical appearance or their age or my age relative to their age or something about the environment that we're in, I have an idea about what their goals are or how passionate they are or are not going to be about some topic. And I often don't know that I have those biases until the person reveals themselves to be different than what I'd assumed. And that's kind of uncomfortable. Wait a second, this little monkey part of my brain is going, right? this person is not acting the way I thought they were going to act. What's happening here? Um, and what you're describing is different, but I think
Yeah,
it's in that larger
yeah,
category of um, what do we want this person to be like? What do we expect? And I think you're kind of getting into what do we value or what feels safe. So there are some additional elements to it.
yeah,
And I don't think there's like an easy answer. Um, and it would be great for me to just sit here and say like, oh, you just have to set that aside and kind of be, right. I can say all these things that are true to a certain extent. You're not there for you. You're not
yeah,
there to discuss politics. You just need to focus on your research questions and do your session. And like, that's true. But, right, it's
yeah.
hard because you're a person and you come in as a messy human being with lots of experiences in the world and assumptions about how you want it to be. I'm going to interject myself here for a moment. I have
Yes,
another book that's all about this. And
good. Yeah,
my book is called Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries. And
yeah,
it's about the kinds of experiences that
yeah.
people have. There's a story in there about someone going to meet a farmer, in fact, and
It's not
the
me.
no, it's not you. The researcher in that story is a woman who's bringing an assistant slash driver, and the farmer's from kind of a previous generation to the researcher and will not take her seriously, just keeps taking the man's point of view and assuming that she's the wife or the
Wow.
assistant.
Yeah,
So this sounds like we're being really hard on farmers today.
that's not.
There's
Yeah,
just many stories about going out of your bubble into somebody else's bubble, and how do you get treated, or what do you see? People in this book, it's all researchers' other stories. They're not my stories. You go into an environment where somebody is not taking good care of their health, and
yeah,
their home is like unsafe, and there's pets, and it's just kind of chaos. And how do you go into that environment? How do you conduct yourself? How do you feel? Um, and so I think, right, we judge. I mean, if you see a sign for a political something, you
yeah,
judge, and I mean, that's a human survival skill, right? We have to fill in the blanks to sort of understand what we're going into.
yeah,
Um, I don't know. I want to throw it back on you. Like, what did you do? How did you feel kind of before, during,
yeah.
after?
Well, well, the first thing I thought of is really is as you have it in your book where you say check your worldview at the door. I think that's the phrase that you're using, and what helped me really is to say kind of assume this position of saying, hey, this is a unique opportunity to understand somebody you otherwise wouldn't talk to, right? You don't have, I think maybe you see this differently, but I don't think you need to agree with somebody in order to understand them. So I think there is understanding is possible, and you can just listen to their point of view, which you would never take otherwise. But it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for 1 hour or so, whatever time you have, to see something, to see the world from a point of view that you otherwise would never. And that, if I can do that, and if it stays within kind of a reasonable limit of, let's say, moral and legal boundaries, then I find that a positive experience, or at least then I can take something from it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, and now you're making me think that it's easier for me as Steve, the researcher, to have that conversation than it is
Yes.
as like Steve,
Yes.
the dude that lives in Northern California and has his
Yeah.
own,
Yeah.
views of the world. Because, right, you can play the role of the authentically curious
Exactly.
listener and create space and
Yeah.
not have to bring yourself into it. Like, you didn't say that you chose
Yeah.
to disagree or argue or share your point of view. Um, I think, sometimes situations that, go towards the edges of what we kind of normally encounter, sometimes, I think the risk is you might encounter someone that wants to engage you, that wants to push you
Yes.
beyond the boundaries of the role that you want to take. And
Yeah.
I might feel more risk about that I get pulled into things. And I write in Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries about meeting someone who had very strong religious beliefs. We were talking about technology and not religion, and was trying to get something out of me in the interview that I didn't know how to manage my
Navigate it.
role.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that is maybe the exception. And I think, yeah, you encounter things all the time. And so
Yeah.
what's it like to have way more children than I'm familiar with, or what's it like to have political views um and depending on like what you're actually there to learn about, you can start to see some relationships between maybe, you
Yeah.
know, right. And again, I don't know anything about your topic here, but sometimes farmers come from a certain economic background, and sometimes because their concerns are different than knowledge workers who work on computers, they respond to different things going on
Yeah.
politically. They have different goals and objectives. And the thing that you're trying to learn that your client is working on starts to connect. You start to connect the
Yeah.
dots between some things that you wouldn't otherwise
Yeah.
be exposed to because no one in the company that makes this stuff
Yeah.
sees the world this way, has these kind of political alignments. Um, and it can be insightful. Like you said, I think you're kind of saying you get to go into a world and understand something you wouldn't otherwise understand, which is good for us as humans and maybe revelatory for what our
Yeah.
kind of business objective is in doing that.
Yeah. It's nice that you mentioned the business objective, because I think that's it actually is relevant to that. I mean, because it's so. I mean, I cannot tell you that much about the bigger context, but it is a company that comes from, let's say, a very different mindset than their customers, and somehow you need to bridge that. So it's clear that there is a mismatch because, well, on the one hand, otherwise I wouldn't be doing interviews, and kind of their communication doesn't resonate. So I think it's paramount for them to understand a very different point of view than their own. Right.
Can I
Sorry,
just
go
add?
on.
Oh, I just want to add that I had an experience very recently that I haven't fully processed. And so this is just an example, but not
Mm,
advice for everyone about how to do this, because I think the question is hard to answer. But
yeah.
I was interviewing people who had gone through an extremely difficult and traumatic medical situation.
Oh wow.
And I
Yeah.
knew that going in. And so you come in with, I don't know, compassion but just trying to figure out how to deal with something fairly difficult and just meet that person where they are and understand that.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the conversation, yeah, they revealed something about themselves and their family, yeah, politically, culturally, that yeah, I didn't agree with. And it was very troubling for me because I couldn't I couldn't stop thinking about it during the interview. And I
Yeah.
think, I mean, I will say before everyone's like, oh, Steve, you're a terrible person. Like, I kept it to myself. Like, I think you can have a little place in your head where you put something. So
Yeah.
my discomfort or judgment or disappointments, or even feeling vulnerable that, yeah, I stepped into in kind of an uncomfortable place. Um, I don't, no one would know. No, there was no observable difference in my
Yeah.
compassion, my listening, my, interest in what this person's experiences was and what they had to share. But I had a little voice in my head that was just like, I don't know. It wasn't a red flag. It wasn't sort of an anger thing. It was just almost like a disappointment that and it was disappointment in myself. Like I wanted to, in the ideal version, just kind of take that as a piece of information and say, oh, this person is part of, this group or this movement, and just set it aside. But I couldn't.
Yeah.
It kept kind of coming back around and kind of like tapping me on the shoulder. So it was really distracting me. It was distracting me almost emotionally from how I wanted to be with this person. Um, Yeah, I mean, it's sort of abstract, I guess. I think there's
Yeah.
often a voice that's talking to you about the person in the interview while you're trying to do the interview. And I think
Yes.
because the information being shared with me was dramatic and I had this dramatic reaction, it was harder for me to sort of hold all these different
Yeah.
containers at the same time. Um, but I did, and I was with a couple of other people when we came out. Eventually, we talked about it, but I don't think no one would have known, like, you
Yeah.
know, if you have like when you have a dog or something and their ears go up, like you wouldn't have, if you looked at me, you wouldn't have seen any physical reaction. You wouldn't have seen any change. And so I was happy with how I conducted the interview, but I was really thinking about myself and the challenge in just finding a place to put that
Yeah.
that's like far outside and that
Yeah.
it was distracting and sort of disruptive for me. I wanted to be able to do better than that, and I guess I have to just accept that's just, I don't know, we're getting very squishy here, but it is kind of forgive yourself or accept yourself
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
kind of moment for me.
Yeah. How can how do I have to imagine an interview situation? So the situation that you're describing in, I mean, are there techniques where you can say, well, how to deal with distractions? Is that the process you just described, is that a mental thing? Do you
Mm,
write it down somewhere? Are there kind of techniques to keep you in that role of a researcher and not kind of get distracted? Because I think in an interview, you're always, and that's really hard at the beginning, you're always kind of thinking in two at two levels, right? You're thinking about the conversation, you're in the conversation and thinking about the conversation at the same time.
yeah,
So,
right. At least two, right?
yeah,
And so this is why, managing the equipment, are running out of storage space or batteries, and managing your colleagues, who's going to ask I guess that's kind of thinking about the conversation. Um, yeah, if you can keep it to at least two, to at most two, I
yes,
think you're better. And I don't know if there's a technique. It is mental. You're right. I mean, that is kind of the job, is to be, and this doesn't even make sense, right? You want to be as present as possible,
yeah,
and it's kind of you want to be in the forest and the trees at the same time, and
yeah,
kind of hold on to them. Um, so yeah, you ask someone a question and you're looking at them and nodding, and kind of your body language is doing all the I'm listening stuff, but part of your head is saying, what am I going to say next?
what's the next
Uh,
question? Yeah,
yeah, and you have to do that.
yeah,
Um, and I don't know, I think it's kind of a muscle that you build with practice. Um, and I think it's probably a little different for everybody. Um, I try to kind of what I think computers I used to call it like time slicing, right? Like, be mostly in this and then sort of have those moments where you're like, Voop, I'm gonna like go over here and think about what I want
mm,
to talk about next. Um, it's great to have questions prepared ahead of time so that if you like, I got nothing, you're like, you just pick up your thing and say, okay, we're gonna like switch here for a second and just, go to your piece of paper. I'm holding up a piece of paper. So you have some kind of techniques. Um, there's probably a principle from improv that we could apply here where, um, you know, if you're talking to someone, like you asked me this question, I've been going on for what, like 90 seconds or 2 minutes now.
mm,
I've been going on and on. Um, and you, as you're sitting here asking this question, you're probably, I'm going to guess, coming up with the next question the whole
yes.
time, as
It
well as trying
changes
to,
all the time, but
it changes, yes. So the the follow-up question that you have at the beginning of my long, digressive response is probably not as good as the one that comes at the tail end, where you can connect the question to what just happened,
yeah,
right? If I stop right now, sorry, I'm making this super awkward for both of us. If I stop right now, whatever you're going to ask, it might be from what I just said,
yeah,
or if you're going to go back, or if you're going to move on, then you have to lay down some connective tissue.
yes,
my next question, Steve, is, or does, Scott or Jonathan have any questions? Or sorry, I'm doing your interview for you.
No, but
Or I
that's
want to
okay.
go
I mean,
back to,
that would
uh,
have been exactly my trick because I saw Jonathan move, kind of getting closer to the microphone. So I know he's wanting to ask a question. So that would have been my that's my plan B. It's just say, hey, Jonathan, I think you wanted to ask a question, right?
yeah. So
Yeah,
you're,
it's correct. But and I really enjoyed listening to this thought process because that my question is really around this. Like, what's top of mind when you're doing these interviews? And you described exactly what happened to me actually, because you were talking about something, and then I had something kind of popped up, and I was like, okay, I've got a bit of a question around that. And then you talked a bit further, and then the question got refined somewhat. And I was kind of you are kind of in multiple spaces at the same time, and I think that is
Yeah.
the tricky aspect of it. But my question was basically that is like, what would you say is the mindset one is in when one is interviewing, and I know one is not supposed to suggest answers, but I'll do it anyway because I just feel it evokes a bit maybe the idea. But is it are you like in a opportunistic mode or like kind of hunter mode of okay, what is this person going to say next and what can I jump on? Or are you in kind of a more management, let's manage the flow of this to direct it towards whatever objective I'm trying to get to? What's the next? I want to get this in part, a bit of information out of the person. Like, what would you say is the major mode of mindset you're in when you're doing these interviews?
that's, yeah, I'm just pausing here and I'm going to do the response, which is like, that's a very good question, which is just a way
Give some time.
yeah. And I'm thinking, I want to just distinguish between the interview that we're all doing now and then,
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
research interviews, because, um, when we are doing this, we also have an audience. And so I think we
Yes.
make different decisions about, to your point, Jonathan, like what's our mode? And sorry, I don't want to, I'm the guest, so I'm obviously in a different mode than the three of you are here, but we're aware that we're sort of making a piece of content to be edited and be consumed by others. So what we're trying to get to, and I don't want to speak for you, but as a podcast host, I use different
Yeah.
rules. I'm trying to get to something else. Um, I so it's different. We can use some of the same techniques, but I think that mode for me is different. But in an interview, yeah, I am. I like all those things. It's like, sorry, you had hunting and you had managing, and the first one was really good too. What was the first?
I'm sorry, I've forgotten what I said now, but I
Yeah,
think
it
it was
was.
basically hunting, trying to manage for an objective and or
Yeah,
hunting or
I, I
opportunistic, being opportunistic.
opportunistic. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that word a lot. I I think about and this is it's not really the most elegant phrase, but it's like cracking the nut, which is like, trying to untie a knot or,
Yeah.
unravel something, solve a puzzle. And I don't like that phrase because it sort of characterizes the person I'm interviewing as a puzzle or a problem or a knot or something negative. Um, there's a point in a lot of interviews where you as much as you can for somebody that you've just met. Like you get them. And it's a very subjective, soft kind of outcome. Um, but that's what I'm in pursuit of. I want to reach a point where, like we have connected,
Mhm.
which is a feeling, and maybe that feeling goes both ways. Um, but where we've established some connection, I get them. We have a little bit more permission. The sharing is more free flowing, but the sharing on their part is deeper and reflective.
Yeah.
Right. So some people you might
Yeah.
meet and they're like, yeah, I'll tell you anything, blah, 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 blah. They talk a lot, but you don't get to them being thoughtful because it's the beginning of the interview. And so this is a state I want to kind of get to where I'm, yeah. peeling back the layers of the onion. I think all these metaphors are kind of broken. What's the um, it was a Da Vinci that said like that the statue is in the marble and it's my job to kind of uncover it. I sometimes think of that. Again, none of these are like good metaphors for a person to person kind of interaction, but
Scott is the expert on that metaphor.
It was Michelangelo.
okay, sorry. I knew whoever I said it was going to be the wrong one. I stuck. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So
And I'm trying to. So I guess what I'm prioritizing is the person, and everything else kind of flows from there. I don't say like that's what anyone else should do. I think that's just, how I kind of orient myself towards it. And so, yeah, you go in with prepared questions, and objectives. And I definitely want to meet those and have to meet those. But I don't think the path to get there is to kind of go like, okay, this, and now that. And so I don't know if that's not quite opportunistic. That's maybe like an example, Jonathan, you didn't give, which is like a by the numbers or kind of a rote approach. I'm trying to get there in some roundabout way. And if I get to this Michelangelo like understanding of the person, within the time that we have, I might be able to answer questions myself. So we want to learn from the research. What does this person think? What do they do? What are their problems? It's not, can I get them to tell me all that? It's, can I get to my own understanding of that? And so there may be things that no one literally says, but they talk around it through this kind of conversation. You can walk away and say like, okay, it's pretty clear that this, and this, and this. And so, yeah, and there's nothing wrong with opportunistic hunting, even rote kind of by the numbers. I think those are all ways to get at different things. We're all kind of wired differently. And, I have been doing this a long time and written books about it. So I have just I don't know, a level of experience you have to be as old as me for one thing, to have done this. So there's ways that work for me. I'm really big on people having different ways that work for them based on what powers them. And my curiosity or my sense of that, sculpture within the marble is it's an animating energy for me. And that I think I can pull stuff out of the session that way. I'm going to stop here.
It's a bit like hand-to-hand combat to me, in that maybe that's not the best metaphor either, but in that you're reacting, you're responding, and everyone's different. Every single interaction is different. We teach, and as you do as well, we teach folks how to do interviews, and I usually give them something more structured to begin with, like sort of, because they all make the same mistakes initially. They ask long, unwieldy questions. So I already know every mistake they're going to make up front, but at some point, I completely agree with you. Really, it's like your own personality, and everybody's going to develop a unique style at some point, and you sort of have to. I mean, I'll just give a couple examples. If you're extroverted, well, you've got a nice advantage that you'll be gregarious and chatty, and you'll get the person engaged very early. But it might not be as natural for you to get deep beyond the surface. If you're introverted, you might have to work a little harder to build that rapport, but you're going to be more patient. Maybe I'm making some assumptions here, but maybe a better listener, and you'll be more genuinely curious. Those are perhaps two stereotypes, but I think my broader point is we all have certain strengths, weaknesses, and I think that's the place that an interviewer needs to get to, where they lean into what they, to be accepting of themselves for a little uniqueness of style. And that's also why we interview multiple people, because but some of them will be amazing. You learn lots of stuff. Some will be terrible and you won't learn anything. And so when I'm teaching this, I'm trying to tell people, don't take it personally. Like, don't evaluate yourself on how it's going, like minute by minute. You sort of have to, if you're always observing yourself and being critical, that extra meta thinking, I think, is counterproductive. Anyway, the broader point, I just wanted to agree with you that Everybody I think does have a unique style, and that's okay.
I want to add to, if I could, to some of what we're talking about. And Scott, maybe you have an example of this, but I think the you've got the conversation and the thoughts about the conversation. And if you observe too much, it's too much. It pulls you out. Um, Rarely, but sometimes I have found like a flow state come
Mm,
from trying to manage. It seems like this seems like too much. We're talking about it in a way I think that makes it seem hard.
mm,
Um, but I feel like I found, I don't know, like a gear in between the two gears sometimes where
Mm.
everything slows down. And I feel like I have all this time to think about the next question and all this time to sort of check in. I don't know how to make that happen reliably, but it sort of confirms what we're talking about, because if you do it enough or do it and the conditions align, like it actually works better. I think to me the flow state is like very, very wonderful and peaceful, and you can sort of pull all these things together. I don't know.
Yeah.
Now I'm asking questions. Sorry, guys.
No,
Yeah, it
that's
makes
all good.
complete sense, but I think it also speaks a bit to the unpredictability of doing these because you're not going to predict when that flow state happens or if it happens. There's so many variables involved. I mean, you might be tired, they might be tired, and then there's the thing that Jan began with. Maybe if you pick up on there's like a very stark difference between you and the folks. But you know what? That's also sort of what makes it fun, right? You're getting to know new people. You're learning things you don't know. You're seeing things from a new perspective, and that can therefore you need to grow some muscles, some listening muscles, some empathy muscles.
Yeah. Can you ask just to maybe elaborate a little bit, Steve, on especially maybe if you're just kind of starting out the interviewing, or it's not
Mm.
your kind of second nature stuff, like how how would you advise somebody like that to prepare? How much detail should you go to? What are things that you would need to be yeah, radiation, and then maybe it's a different question also how to use them in the interview. So can you elaborate a little bit on this, some advice on that?
And right when we might want to go back quite a ways to why do we think we want to do this research to begin with?
Yes.
Um, so what is it that our clients or our team, whoever our working relationship is, our stakeholders, what is it that we're faced with as an organization, as a team?
Yes.
Um, and being clear about that. What's the challenge or opportunity such that we feel, oh, well, what we better do is do some research.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
and I know I write about it as the business challenge and the research question. There are two things. The business
Yeah.
challenge is about us. Like, what do we have to do? Oh, the builder that we use to ship the software is going end of life, so we have to go to a new platform, and so we're going to have to revisit all this part of our, design infrastructure. So that's about us. And then we need to figure out what's the question we want the research to answer. Um, I don't know, what's parts of this flow of the current product are essential. How do we prioritize? How do people kind of prioritize these infrastructure dependent components of how they do their job, which
Yeah.
might even just be like, how do they do their job? What's sort of the ideal flow using our tool? So if you answer that research question, then you have the information to answer
Yes.
the business question.
Good.
And neither of those are consistently made explicit. You
Yes.
know, people don't, think about things this clearly. They're like, we need to do some research. And so sometimes you have to say, well, why? What is it we want to learn? Oh, we want to learn about these customers and their workflow. Well, why do we want to learn that? Oh, because we have to do these other things. So I
Yeah.
think part of the alignment activity at the beginning is to elicit these sort of topics or answers to these questions
Yeah.
among a broad group of people and focus and prioritize. Like, it's a lot of discussion to get to what's it we're going out here to do.
Yeah.
If you
But I
have
think
that, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I think this is just, I just want to emphasize this because I see what I see quite often is this distinction between, you call it business challenge and research question, that gets just mumbled together. And then in kind of worst case, what then sometimes happens is that they go out with their business questions and kind of ask them almost like in too directly to their cut. They will get answers,
Yeah.
but probably they're not going to be useful. So why is this? There is almost like a translation that needs to happen there between the business perspective or the internal perspective, and then translate that into research, if I understand you correctly here.
I think there's two translations. One is the business question, business challenge and research question. So what do we have to do? What do we want to learn? And then the actual questions that you ask.
Right.
Because our business question is, this infrastructure is going offline. So we could go do unsuccessful research about that. Our research question is, I don't know, what are people's workflow?
Yeah.
That's not really the right thing to ask. And we've all had research questions that you really can't ask because people don't have any reflection about it or any insight, or it's sensitive. Right? If you're dealing with a medical issue and you're like, how can we best support this and this and this? People don't know the answer to that. So the questions you ask. So my hierarchy is, or my segmentation is like business challenge, research question, participant questions, which is the discussion guide or the interview guide or the protocol or all that's what you're going to do in the session. And you got to translate at each stage. Yeah. So I totally hear you. So here's what we want to learn. How are we going to have a conversation with this person about that? And so you've got to figure out, what are your questions to prepare? And I tend to like to write a prototype, kind of a platonic ideal of how the interview might go. Here's where we're going to start. And then here's where we're kind of, here's what the meat of it is. And here's what these reflection questions are and conclusion questions. At least
I had that for today's session.
Yeah.
But I kind of threw it out the window at the beginning, but that's a different.
No, that's a great example, right? You sent me a list of questions and with headings, and it flowed. And then peek behind the curtain. You told me at the beginning you wanted to start from a different place, and the interview unfolded so far from where from a different starting place. But I'm going to say that having prepared those questions, you're still more prepared to do the improvisation that you have kind of orchestrated.
Yes.
So to be prepared doesn't mean that you follow like some people call it a script, your interview script. And I mean, I think there's certain kinds of research where you are going to do a script. Like maybe there's certain types of usability testing or something very evaluative or closed-ended where you want to go through a certain sequence of tasks and topics and questions. But the kind of thing that I'm guessing you did with your farmer, or that we're sort of generally talking about, is you have topics, but you're also going to see where the conversation takes you. And it's you made that point. I really like that. It's the conversation, and it's thinking about the conversation. So that gives you some freedom, but it also creates a challenge. But I think if you go to talk to this farmer and you have your one-page printout or your whatever on your screen, and you just kind of go, question 1, blah, 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 blah. Question 2, blah, 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 blah. Like you're not going to get to the statue in the stone. Sorry, Scott, I just saw that you have that book sitting there.
That's why.
Sorry about that. Like the book is right there. You can't do that by just asking us by reading a script. So you want to be prepared, but prepared doesn't mean you show up and do the thing.
Yeah.
So, yes, when you're starting out, right, you could imagine how somebody develops. Their first few interviews are going to be sticking to the script. So write a good script and, do your best to add some follow-ups and add some improvisations and, respond to what you're hearing and ask a different question or ask your question in a different sequence. I think you have to be fairly experienced and comfortable to go backwards. Like sometimes you can start from the last question, or you can start in the middle, or you can start from something that just happened to you today. But yeah, that comes with confidence and kind of willingness to experiment. So, right, if I had to just, how should somebody start? Understand the problem space, understand your objectives, have like a really robust set of questions, and be prepared to ask them in kind of a semi-improvisational manner, right? With a little bit of, in the moment. And I guess the key here is follow-ups. If I had to sort of say what's the tactic, right? Ask follow-up questions. And, you can do, I don't know, my holdover from being like a little kid was like liking to peel a tangerine all in one. Can you sort of challenge yourself to make it all come out in one thing? Like I feel that way about an interview, just if we're going to keep throwing metaphors. I'm going to keep throwing metaphors out here.
Yeah.
Can you do an interview by asking one question and then have everything else kind of follow up? So it all kind of unfolds from what the person says. That's hard. Like I'm sorry, we're talking about the person starting out. Like you don't start out with that. But I think if you have that model in mind, that you can actually ask all your questions or many of them as follow-ups.
I love that.
Yeah.
For me, I'm not at all an expert interviewer, but what you just said, like it's like, oh, that's amazing. That's really, I find that such a, you can apply this in your thinking. It's a way of thinking that I could see myself definitely applying. Yeah, I really like that that metaphor. And I mean, talking about follow-up questions, what for you would be a well-written research question? Is there do you have a formal way of writing that? I mean, what is a well-posed research question?
I'm just going to be slightly pedantic. We're talking about the question we ask participants or the research question for the project, the objective.
Yeah, so you mentioned these three different.
Okay.
So we have the business problem or the business issue you're trying to address. You have the research, I think you called it research question.
Yeah,
and then you have the questions to the actual questions. And I'm wondering, what is a well formulated research question?
Yeah, and it can be it can be a main question with sub questions. I think so. It could be right. What are the main workflows that people are using to do blah 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 task? And then maybe there's a sub bullet or two that's like what parts of the current infrastructure are successful for people. What ways would people like to see their workflow optimized? So it's like a main question with a couple of sub questions. I think I'll say that the process of writing the research question and the business challenge and the participant questions, that process is probably more important than the artifact. So I wouldn't say you should make one like this. I think because as you go through it, you're like, oh, it's 3 questions with sub questions, or it's a paragraph, or I don't really care what people produce. Sometimes I've seen people just go a lot of different ways about it. I think it's just that kind of thinking that prepares you. That's probably my.
I 100% agree. I've often said that the process of creating a discussion guide has tremendous value, but then the discussion guide itself is sort of it's almost like it's a thought experiment in the scope and everything you want to explore. It's like it prepares you so that you almost don't need it. Having said that, to this day, I find it a necessary security blanket that if so, if I don't know why, if it doesn't make sense, but there's this fear of what if I have nothing to ask? And that situation never happens, but that fear, if I'm honest, never totally goes away. It doesn't for me. And so having my discussion guide, it's just a little security. It's just a little security blanket. And one more thing to support your point, Steve, I did an unusual project some years ago, and it was a group of engineers were trained in doing voice of customer, and they had many hours, and they had written a discussion guide, and what they wanted our company to come in to do was to take the transcripts and pull the insights out of it. It was very unusual in that we weren't doing it. But in going through, and they had a very high sample size for qualitative work, but they literally covered the exact same ground, the exact same way every single time. And, they're after going through it all, after you'd gotten through 20% of it, they weren't learning anything new. And I think that's where a more experienced interviewer would say, hey, let's explore something new, or come at this from a different angle, or, a different perspective, because we're not getting anything new. But to them, that was perfectly logical. They wrote their discussion guide, and they're going to go in there and they're going to ask all those questions. I don't know that I would ever have thought about that having not gone through it. But I think, with a little bit of experience, you realize there's value in going at it at different angles to try to, you might focus on this topic more in one, and this topic more in another, and this topic more in a third one.
Yeah, they're right. These artifacts we're talking about are prototypes, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
Here's how I think this interview is going to go. Here's where I think the interesting stuff is. Here's what questions we have. But this is always an exercise in what we don't know that we don't know.
Right.
And so that's where those follow-ups, I think, are so important, to have that moment of like, oh, so you're saying that this is like calling 911. Okay, well, what's the emergency when you're using this part of the, we better ask about that, and to sort of get those clues and get beyond that 20%. Otherwise, yeah, you're just right. And you, Scott, know there's stuff being left on the table. You can see that. But yeah, without that experience, and maybe that's that mindset of what is the purpose of this guide, and what is this purpose of this plan? And are we doing sort of science that's kind of replicable, and we do the same experiment every time? Which for some types of research, yes, you want to be able to run some stats on whatever error rate or time on task, then for sure. But if you're trying to get to what we don't know, that we don't know about a topic that we don't really understand, we have beliefs about, then yeah, you have to do what your people were choosing not to do.
Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned the thing that I still find to be the most difficult, and I've just sort of accepted that I'm at the limits of my intellectual ability. I'm not going to get better at it, and it's to listen while still formulating that next question. I don't seem that, to me, that's the most difficult. What do you find to be most difficult?
I do find that difficult. Well, right, I'm doing it right now. I think to put a pause in as the interviewer, to give myself space to think about what I want to talk about, and feels, especially when we're doing research, not podcasts, we're doing research over Zoom. I think that makes us a little more like in media, like we're digital faces on the TV screen. And I think it's harder for me to put dead air into a computer screen. If I'm sitting with somebody,
Right.
Yeah.
You can sit in somebody's office, or in their shed or something. You can have some silences. You can take some pauses, because you can look around or shift in your seat, or kind of be engaged and present and interactive, and maybe take a big inhale, or pick up your pen, or just all the things that you can't display or receive if we're just faces in front of microphones, like we are in this environment, like we are in remote research. So I think that what question to ask next thing, without silence, to give me time to collect, and not just sort of react, I think feels harder because of the technology.
Mm-hmm. Can we stay a bit on the topic of silence just for a moment? I think that's usually I think that's the main fear that people have, like, especially if you're kind of starting out interviews, somebody is watching you doing it, and we want to avoid at all costs. It does is silence. So, but I found this to be tremendously useful from time to time. It's hard to actually shut up, especially, I mean, that's more a personal problem, but it's hard to shut up. But how do you see silence as a, let's say, as a tool, as a research tool? Like, when do you think is it useful? When should it be also maybe avoided? So
there's this idea that sort of people speak in paragraphs, and like if you ask a question, right? I don't know. One of my question is, what how many years have you had this farm?
Yeah.
So you can ask that question, and the person might say, oh, we've had this farm for 8 years. And what I think is going on is like they don't know how much to say.
yes.
And so we do, as we're doing in this interaction, right? Nodding, and giving those little signals that acknowledge that you heard the other person. And so I think silence exists as a technique with some other adjacent techniques, which basically just say, I've heard you, I'm paying attention. Do you want to go on? Right. So, right. How long have you had this farm? We've had this farm for 5 years. Then you do nothing. Right. And the person says, we had another farm down the road that was my grandfather's, but we divided up the land, and with the money we got from that, we decided to buy the smaller farm. So your question, it's not how long did you have this farm? 5 years. Why did you buy this farm? Like it's that, that script mode where every question gets one answer and you kind of do it like a verbal survey. You're trying to just unpack more details. So when you ask a question, you can use silence as a way to have them continue. And silence isn't just silence, because we do a lot of communication with our bodies. So lean forward, lean back, nod while they're talking, nod when they finish talking. There's a half nod that you can do, which is kind of like,
right,
like chin up, which is kind of like, it's kind of, and this is all very personality dependent, but it's kind of like, it's almost like a bro-y thing, like, right? And just go, or you can say, or you can even say, and you can do that with a question, like, or you can just say it as almost like a grunt. You can.
I feel very self-conscious now.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
No.
You can crinkle your eyes, or you can just kind of put your eyebrows up. That just says, these are all ways that say like, I'm listening, I'm thinking, and like you can make a question mark with your face and your body. So it's not just silence, it's like what you do. And for me, I try to do as little as possible, right? And just to keep it as kind of still. And that kind of helps me be calm a little bit and not put all my reactions in. This is much harder over video. Like I think I'll just say for myself, it feels hard to connect this way, that this medium that we're in. And so I tend to do kind of a cartoony version of myself, like
you're overexpressive kind of.
Yes, like my nod is like the big sort of cartoon chicken nod, like just, big gestures, and a lot of them, and fast, and I start earlier and I go longer. Because we're trying to, I think, subconsciously compensate for the technology. Now I feel self-conscious, Jonathan. So thanks for bringing that up.
So now we're all having 3 conversations at the same time in our head.
What's my body doing? And
when should I nod? Is this a good time to nod?
Is this a good time to nod? Yeah. So I think silence has a lot of sort of supporting tools that, and right, we describe it as uncomfortable now, but it's just part of what, like 5 minutes from now, we won't be hopefully thinking about what our bodies are doing. And you might just sort of make individual choices for yourself. Because I think what you're trying to do is basically, we talked about follow-up questions before. I think there's like follow-up question 0, which is just not to say is to let them keep going.
Yeah.
So if we had sort of the, golden space tangerine, you would peel by not even touching, right? I don't I don't know. Like you can just let them keep going. And if can you kind of give them space and gently steer where you want the conversation to go. So you're not really heavily intervening and directing. You're just,
Yeah.
sort of shaping and making space for things. Um, yeah, I could say I'm gonna stop because I could keep
Yeah.
going, but
No, but that's also where we're kind of. I mean, this it feels like 10 minutes, but we could go on for 2 other hours. I feel like, but I want to get maybe kind of going into the last couple of questions here. But you mentioned several times the kind of influence of technology. All right, so we're doing a lot of research. I think most of us have gotten used to Zoom calls and doing that, but using technology to do research now there is all push on AI. We've gotten somehow used to chat GPT stuff. There's talk about synthetic users even. So could you maybe elaborate in this era of technology? We're talking about something in brackets traditional interviewing. So why is it still valuable, or how do you see has the value of interviewing really traditional? I mean, I don't mean this in a derogatory way. Traditional interviewing changed given all the developments that we have around us.
I mean, user research is it's still a new field, but it's a field
Yeah,
that always invents techniques. And there's techniques and books about these techniques and products and platforms. It's changing and growing. And I think, interviewing, we can definitely talk about it as a method and how to do, a whole approach, a whole project. It's also kind of a muscle. It's
yeah,
it's an ingredient in many other ways of, let's just say, being with people who are our participants or our users to learn from them. So I don't, yeah, traditional interviewing, we all have probably a different picture comes into our head when we say that.
yeah,
But, if you're going to run a focus group, I guess very traditional as well, you're going to use some of these same techniques. The context is different. If you're going to be in Zoom or not in Zoom, you're going to use these things. Yeah, and it doesn't, there are just so many methods and they're not all going to use an interview in a traditional way or even as a component. If you're looking at whatever, logs or well, I was going to say surveys, but surveys are also about thinking about how is your question perceived on the receiving
yes,
end and how is the next question, given
yeah,
what you just asked, perceived. So there's a lot of detailed craft in writing a survey that I think shares some DNA with what we're talking about.
yeah.
Yeah, why do I love interviewing? I still believe in it. I still advocate for it. I still do it. It does go back to that.
Oh, is it just on my end or?
Nope.
I
Oh, I think Steve froze, right?
He did, I think. It's not a silence.
It's it's not a silence. Ah,
Okay.
let me see if I can write him.
This is a trick. This is an interviewing
This is
trick.
this is an injury. Yeah,
Very
he's throwing
advanced
us off
maneuver.
off track and
It's
seeing how
it's
we react. Oh, let me write him an email.
if he thinks AI
I want to
can
push him a
review.
little bit on the AI.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
that'd be good. Yeah.
yeah. I think yeah. Hello.
So sorry, my internet connection dropped me and I switched to my
We should
less,
we shouldn't talk about technology, right? That kind of is like
yeah,
It was
right.
Murphy's Law, right?
yeah. um well, let me just then kind of reiterate the question, or ask it in a slightly more direct way. I mean, the more direct way maybe of putting a question is, well, do you believe that, let's go to chat gpt, for example, or whatever kind of tool that you're using, and use that as a almost like a surrogate or a replacement of interviews? Like how do you see the relationship between using AI, and does it solve all our questions? Do we still need to go to users, or can we just kind of put in a prompt and then there we go? Or how do you experience that?
I mean, no, I don't believe in that. Um, I think these tools are changing really rapidly, and there's a lot of hype. And I think we tend to talk about AI as kind of this monolith. It's,
Yeah.
and there's a difference between um, summaries of existing text and
Yes.
replicating people. I think so. There's like our workflows are quite detailed and complicated, and the ways that we use AI now, or we might soon, I think people are really experimenting with them. Yeah, right. There are all these ways that you can use existing data of some sort and have a chat GPT like device kind of query them or simulate a query of them. And every time someone does a little experiment with them, the results are, well, they're what I would expect. They're not encouraging.
Yeah.
And there's a professor from, I think, Berkeley that basically took one of her own studies and then, used one of these tools to produce some results, and then wrote up this nice analysis that kind of compared, like, here's
Yeah.
what our research revealed, here's what the simulation revealed. The week that we're having this conversation, Nielsen Norman Group just, I think, did a similar
Yes.
experiment that I've seen the headlines. I haven't really dug into it, so I can point to it, but I can't kind of cite it. And so I guess I'm kind of looking to people that are trying this stuff to kind of carry the weight of demonstrating what it can do and can't do. I can be kind of I don't know, the reactionary person and say, well, this is no good. I think people are trying to figure out what it is good for.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and we sort of talked about interviews as, we're getting data, but we're also getting to a point of our own understanding. Like that's really
Yes.
what I'm seeking, is like, oh, I get what we've been talking about, this problem internally. Now I understand it. And so I really want those moments of revelation. And that is, to me, going through the process.
Yeah.
I don't think I can't read that. So I have to
Yeah.
experience it. Um, so that's what I'm after, sort of this experiential, participatory, kind of real time learning to get me to a point where I have a nuanced, insightful take on something that we haven't kind of been able to get to. There's different kinds of questions. And so, right, can Chat GPT or whatever the platform
Whatever.
is,
Yeah.
lead an unmoderated remote, or a moderated, or a robot moderated test? Maybe. I mean, if you have a bunch of set questions and you're going to ask those same questions, you're not going to ask follow-ups or limited follow-ups. Maybe that technology is great and is, efficient. I think if you take the human out of it, then you devalue, or you limit the opportunity of that human to have insights about what the data is telling.
Yeah.
So if I'm a researcher and I read my, Chat GPT moderated report versus I run those sessions, it's probably going to be a different experience for me. And maybe more efficient, maybe less efficient.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, we're still in the infancy right now.
I want to just point to something that you said there, which I really resonated with me, and I think this for me is then it's difficult to show to others, but I feel like doing interviews is there's a lot of value in the process of. I mean, you change during doing interviews. Your understanding of something changes, and it's sometimes it's less about the answers, the actual answers, but about that change, and it's like it, and that I find sometimes very hard to. I mean, how do you show that or kind of take somebody along, a stakeholder or whatever, in that process of kind of how your perspective changed when they were not in the interviews? So quite often I have the experience that I did, I don't know, 20 interviews or so, and I have 20 in my mind, and I know exactly kind of what the change was, but you need to tell somebody who never saw a minute and has 30 minutes that they will listen to you. So any advice on this kind of how then to translate them, how to bring it back basically to the business? Yeah, that was a very vague question, but I hope it's
Well,
enough
there's
to.
a few facets to that, right? Um, right. There's probably like one question says, well, do we need to, right? I think maybe this is a thing that researchers get criticized for is wanting to have everybody else to have that rich experience when
Yeah.
maybe they don't need to. And I think, maybe in my history, as a lot of researchers work in-house as part of teams. And I think sometimes in the best possible situations, there's a lot of trust there. And so when there is trust and acceptance and belief and buy-in and all that great stuff, which I think does happen, the researcher maybe doesn't need to induce that change, but can just talk about what the implications are, and how we should take action on it. I think when there isn't trust or you work outside the organization, I want to have somebody else have that change so that they're armed and confident to go forward with taking action. So it seems like it's a persuasion technique. If you kind of can go with me on this path and see something about, how the world is different than what we assumed, then you're going to believe me more than if I say, okay, first of all, we assumed this was true about the world, but we learned this other thing. If that person is kind of sitting with their arms folded, being like, here's what I think the world is like. So without that trust, so I think that's part of the context that is shifting, and that, we shouldn't take it for granted as being always negative, or not having that buy-in.
Yeah.
But I think regardless, you can try to create a lot of lightweight moments along the way. Like what we don't want to do is, have some alignment around the research question and be like, all right, see you in 3 weeks. And then somehow try to, in 30 minutes, give somebody a boiled down version of your experience with those 20 interviews. And so I like to do just very short sort of storytelling things. Like I might create a thread in Slack that just says like, today we met with Scott. Scott has a wood paneled office that he's been trapped in for the last 6 years, but he has a lovely book collection. And he told us how, he plays the guitar and he's never not going to play the guitar, even if his fingers fall off. Sorry, Scott. That's just that was kind of stupid, but that level of detail, which doesn't capture Scott and everything that we learned and everything that I was changed by, but just points to Scott's name and some like details that bring him to life for people, and using things like Slack where you can just post those and they can sit and someone may look at it and just even like give it a little thumbs up tick. Or, in the best situation, ask a question. It's like, do we have other users who are trapped in their wood paneled rooms? Well, no, Scott was an exception, and we found him because we were recruiting, people in basements. I don't know. Like you can use it to provoke a lightweight dialogue or not. But I think making some part of your work, kind of putting it up on the wall, giving names and faces and little anecdotes, like tiny, tiny amounts of information. Not reports, not synthesis, not patterns, not implication. It's almost free for you to do that. And it's almost free for someone to consume it, or at least know like, hey, that information is over there. And so they can at least see you're walking down a path and maybe get interested or excited. And maybe they've sat in on one. And so when you get to that point where they have 30 minutes, it's not, hello, remember me from 3 weeks ago. It's here's the next part of the conversation that's ongoing. And so that you bring them along in really lightweight ways, and if our team is like, they're going to sit down and have a work session with us, or they want to, as much as we can get their participation, the better. But there's always going to be people that are not on your day-to-day team that you still want to kind of bring along. So I think these are kind of lightweight ways with these stories. I also like to do like a top line report. So something that's, hey, we're done with the interviews. We talked to 20 people. Here's what we're seeing like right now. We haven't done any of the work to make sense of this, but here's some patterns, here's some questions, here's some surprises. Here's the link to the Slack for more information. Any questions right now? Otherwise, in 10 days, we have another readout and we're going to spend 30 minutes and we'll have some video for you and blah, 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 blah. So you make it part of an ongoing conversation that you kind of dole out pieces respectfully, and don't ask too much from people, and give them the opportunity to engage a little bit more.
Right. I like that tip a lot. So I think there's, I mean, in the second edition, I mean, the book is interviewing users, how to uncover compelling insights. And I think you've added a lot on this synthesis and latter part, if I understand correctly. So I really recommend, even if you have the first one, to get the second one. You get a code you get 10%. I think it was 10%. Yeah, right. So you get 10% off if you use the code QUEST, if you go through Rosenfeld Media. There's lots more. I really recommend it. I keep recommending it. Is there anything else, Steve, where you kind of, I mentioned the website. Oh, Jonathan, you have a,
sure. Yeah, could you just spell out spell out the code just so people really, really understand it.
The code is QUEST, so that's QUEST.
And capital or small?
All caps.
All caps, okay.
But I think it doesn't matter. We'll test it out. I think it's all caps. Right, and go through, so it's through Rosenfeld Media, which is a great publisher, by the way. Right. Steve, I mentioned the website, portigal.com. Is there any other place that you want to point people towards if they want to engage with you, find your content? Where should they go?
Yeah, people are welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. I post stuff about what I'm doing. When I'll share this there when you publish it. And also, you briefly mentioned my own podcast at the beginning. Is Dollars to Donuts. That's a podcast where I'm interviewing people who are running research practices in organizations.
Yeah,
and
super interesting.
Yeah, we just hit 50 episodes as of this conversation. So I've been doing it for 9 years intermittently, and just started up in 2024 with a bunch of new ones. So yeah, interesting folks that are in different kinds of companies with different kinds of challenges, talking about how they're succeeding and how they found their way to research, and what a research practice inside a successful organization looks like.
Great. Well, Steve, thank you so much. I have one final question. So is there, usually that's the hardest one of the whole podcast, but is there like the best question? Is there a question that in all your experience you have found to be super useful anytime, all of the time?
No. It's such a creative prompt. I want to come up with like a good one. Yeah, no. I mean, I think is there anything else question is a good one. Is there anything else that we should have talked about? Anything that you want to tell me? I can't say that always produces something, right? I mean, this is a standard journalist question, user research question. You get to kind of the end. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you think we should have covered? And sometimes that person has something lurking, like, oh, you didn't ask about, my pets. It's like, oh, I would never have thought to ask about your pets, or I didn't know that you had pets, or whatever that is, that they want to kind of get in the conversation. I kind of like it because it gives some agency back to them, and it says that, hey, we're kind of creating this conversation together a little bit. Sometimes people say no. I think sometimes what happens too is that people will say, no, I don't have anything that you didn't ask me about. And they will then reflect back or summarize and say, I think this was a good conversation because this, or they'll say, oh, I told you about blah, blah, blah. So you kind of hear their top line takeaways of the interview. But it's not a consistent, boy, I'm glad I asked that question. It's sort of a nice bit of hygiene to do at the end.
So
just see what happens.
It's a very meta way to end it, right?
Yeah, and you can't help but now asking you, Steve, I mean, this question, we need to ask that question. I mean, is there anything that you would like to add?
I also feel like I should have an answer to that. No, and I think you know, I mean, I'm aware of being a guest here, even though I've taken over a little bit.
But that's the goal.
So I kind of I defer to kind of what you want to accomplish for people. Okay, there is yes, and you're giving me a little time to kind of chew on my tongue a little bit. I'm just going to go back, way back to one thing that we talked about, which was the silence piece, and I want to add one piece to it because I think there's another part of silence that's important. We were talking about silence kind of after the question, but there's also this piece about silence kind of in the question. And I think we talked about this indirectly. It's the too long questions, right? I think, Scott, you're saying your people will do that. It's the questions that are too long that also include the suggested answers. And Jonathan, I think you kind of alluded to this a little bit as well. It's the how long have you lived on this farm? Have you been here like 3 years or 5 years? Or it's that putting answers in the question piece, and the how long have you lived in this farm is, and then being silent in your question is really hard.
Yeah.
It's super hard to do that. And but it's very, very important. And here the silence makes, I think, a lot of difference in the power dynamic in the interview. And I think if you're new, you ask these long questions and you figure, yeah, the person will, if I say, is it 3 years or 5 years, and it's only been 1 year, like I give them choices, but I give them the wrong choices. I might think, if I'm one of like, Scott's people, like, oh, they'll just tell me, well, actually it's been 1 year. And I think what happens is we have way more power in these situations than we imagine. And that the more times we tell somebody how to do a good job for us by giving them basically multiple choices, by not being silent. That's the silence piece, right? How long have you lived in this farm? Silence. And the more we train them as to what a good answer looks like, the more they start trying to do a good job for us. And I don't think we understand how much power we have in that dynamic and how important it is not to kind of abuse that power. Just ask the question and like, whoop, just stop. And how hard that is for us to do. And I think, again, I'll just say this, like in remote, it's harder. We're trying to kind of reach through the screen and like, so I'm going to start answering for you to try to get closer to you because I can't really be here with you. I can't hear your breath sounds. I can't give you my silence as easily. So it's really damaging to not do it, and it's really hard to do it. I think just being aware of it, like in this conversation and hearing the next time that you do it, like that's a huge step towards not doing it anymore.
Yeah, that's super. Like, how did you hear about this? Did you Google or how? Like, so it comes so natural, and it's incredibly powerful just to shut up more. I think that's a perfect place to stop. Steve, thank you so much. And that concludes today's Product Quest podcasts. So please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time. And again, Steve, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's nice to meet you all. I really enjoyed it. I hope we'll keep in touch. Have a great day. Thanks again.
All right, take care, Steve. Thanks so much.
Bye, Steve. Take care.